A lot of people in the West still talk about Russia and China as if they are building a new Soviet bloc. Two giants, two civilizations, two anti-Western powers standing shoulder to shoulder against America and Europe. That is the image Moscow wants you to see. See welcomes Putin with red carpets and warm smiles. Russian and Chinese officials speak solemnly about friendship, brotherhood, and new multipolar world. Trade numbers go up, military drills look impressive, and the whole thing starts to resemble a grand alliance. But the image is lying. This is not a partnership of equals. It is a slow transfer of leverage. Russia is not becoming China's twin. It is becoming China's dependent, a source of cheap resources, a useful distraction, a barren northern neighbor with fewer and fewer options. And that is the trap Putin built for himself. He went to war to make Russia look like a great power again. Instead, he pushed Russia away from Europe, away from its best markets, away from advanced technology, and straight into the arms of the one country powerful enough to squeeze it patiently. I am Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union. And today, I want to show you what the Russia-China relationship really is. Not a romance, not a true alliance, but an asymmetrical bargain in which Beijing flatters Moscow in public while gaining more control in private. Here is our roadmap. Not an alliance. Why Moscow and Beijing are moving closer without becoming true allies. The price of dependence. How Russia trades autonomy for markets, machines, and survival. Why Xi is gentle. Why China flatters Russia in public and squeezes it in private. What China really wants. The future Beijing would prefer on its northern border. What the West fears. Which Western fears are real and which are exaggerated. Where this ends. Why this path leads not to Russian greatness, but to a narrow, weaker Russia. If you value this kind of deep dive analysis, subscribe, like, and share. You can also join my think tank, support through PayPal or Super Thanks, or tap hype points. And if you are listening on Spotify, follow the show there too. It really helps. Now, let's start with the first illusion we need to break. This is not an alliance. Not an alliance. The first mistake is to call this an alliance. That word suggests something like NATO, where members are expected to take risks for one another. That is not what exists between Russia and China. Both regimes want the same broad thing, a weaker West and more room to do whatever they like at home and around their borders. That is enough to push them together. But it is not enough to make them trust each other. And this lack of trust is the whole thing. China will not go to war for Russia over Ukraine. Russia will not go to war for China over Taiwan. Beijing will not call Putin an ally in the old military sense because that would create obligations. And China hates obligations that limit its freedom of action. You can see this in the way Beijing supports Moscow with carefully measured help. China has sustained Russia's economy with trade. It has supplied dual-use goods that keep parts of the Russian war machine moving, but it has stopped short of the one step that would truly define an alliance, openly tying its own fate to Russia's. Look at the old power of Siberia II story. Moscow has been chasing this gas deal for years. It matters desperately to Russia because it lost much of the European gas market. And yet, the deal kept stalling because China had no reason to hurry. Even after a memorandum was announced, pricing and timeline were still unresolved. That tells you almost everything. In a real alliance, the stronger side sometimes pays extra to keep the weaker side afloat. China does the opposite. Waits, watches, and bargains harder. Or take military ties. Yes, the two countries drill together more often than before, but they still do not behave like one military system. There is no real integration behind the loud and shiny facade. That is why the phrase no limits partnership is so misleading. The limits are everywhere. They just are not written on the banner. The price of dependence. Now let's look at the structure underneath the speeches. This relationship is dangerous for Russia because it has almost no viable alternative to China as a trading partner. And once you lose alternatives, you stop negotiating and start pleading. That is the real shift. For years, Russia used to sit between big markets, Europe, USA, and China, and play them against each other. That world is gone. Now China is the only remaining big partner, the only country that can provide Russia with markets, equipment, electronics, cars, machine tools, industrial components, and a huge chunk of its economic oxygen. The structure of their trade tells the story. Russia sends oil, gas, coal, metals, timber, and other raw materials. China sends the things a modern industrial economy actually needs to keep functioning: machinery, electronics, vehicles, components, and finished goods. That does not automatically make Russia a colony, but it does create a hierarchy. When your strongest partner can ask for better and better terms because you have nowhere else to go, that is leverage. Again, look at gas. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies noted this spring that China appears to be demanding extremely favorable terms on Power of Siberia 2, reportedly close to Russian domestic gas prices. Think about how humiliating that is. Russia spent decades selling energy abroad as proof of great power status. Now it needs China so badly that Beijing can reportedly ask for terms that would give it huge sway over one of Russia's main export arteries. Or take cars. Chinese vehicles flooded the Russian market after Western companies left. Then the Russian side got nervous enough to raise levies. And all of this comes with a psychological trick. The Kremlin presents this turn to China as proof that Russia is not isolated. But not isolated is not the same as independent. China has more options, a larger economy, and better technology, while Russia has more urgency. And urgency is expensive. So, yes, Russia still has nuclear weapons, a UN Security Council seat, a big army, and a very inflated opinion of itself. But in this relationship, it is the weaker side, the one that needs China much more than China needs it. Why C is gentle? You might wonder, if the relationship between Russia and China is that imbalanced, why does C behave like they are equals? Why throw such lavish receptions for Putin? Why hug him like a dear friend? C does that because it is cheaper, smarter, and more effective than openly humiliating Putin. This is one of the things many Western observers still miss. They look at the red carpets, the warm handshakes, the careful language, and they think, maybe China really sees Russia as an equal. No, China sees Russia as touchy. And when you deal with a touchy man who still has nuclear weapons, a huge border, and a wounded imperial ego, you do not poke him in the face unless you must. You stroke the ego. Then you write the contract with terms that favor your side. China's public style is ritual respect. If you come to Beijing as head of state, you are treated as head of state. The Great Hall, the formal smiles, the performance of mutual admiration. And there's another principle too. Never humiliate a proud authoritarian in public if your real goal is to control him in private. This is not just about Russia. It is also about Chinese political culture. Face, ceremony, and public hierarchy matter a lot. If Beijing wants to squeeze concessions from you, it would much rather do it behind closed doors, where there are no cameras. That is where China's style feels so different from Europe's. Europe spent years trying to combine business with moral language. Sometimes they did it sincerely, sometimes performatively. But it still had the same effect in Moscow. It was seen as a public insult. China does the opposite. It does not ask about murdered opposition leaders or lecture Putin about civil society. Instead, it tells Putin that he is great and his country is a pillar of the world order. That makes the relationship easier for the Kremlin to digest. The Kremlin wants emotional recognition even more than material gain. China understands that. It gives Russia the recognition in symbolic form and takes the gain in practical form. What China really wants. The main thing China needs is that Russia stays useful and dependent and does not cause any trouble for China. Beijing's ideal is a Russia that behaves almost like Canada did for the United States before Trump. A quiet northern neighbor, a source of resources, and a safe strategic rear. Of course, Russia is not Canada. It is too vain, too militarized, too soaked in imperial fantasy. But that does not change the Chinese preference. It only makes the management harder. So what does Beijing actually want? First, cheap and reliable access to raw materials. Oil, gas, coal, metals, timber, agricultural products. The less freedom Russia has to diversify its customers, the better China's negotiation position becomes. This is why every year of sanctions and rupture with Europe quietly improves Beijing's hand. Second, a northern border that stays calm. China doesn't want a hostile Russia. It does not want a chaotic Russia either. A crumbling nuclear state on your border is a nightmare. So the ideal outcome of the war in Ukraine is neither Russian victory nor Russian collapse. It is controlled weakness. Enough stability to trade and enough dependence to profit. Third, diplomatic usefulness. Russia helps China in places where China prefers not to stand alone. At the UN, in anti-Western messaging, and in the performance of multipolarity that forces Washington and Europe to divide attention and resources. A Russia locked in conflict with the West is, in that narrow sense, useful to China even when it is clumsy. Fourth, technology time. China's real long game is global position. Taking and sustaining the lead in chips, EVs, batteries, green tech, critical minerals, and supply chains. That is the real mountain China is climbing. Russia matters mainly as part of the terrain, a country that keeps the West busy while China works on the industries that actually define power in the 21st century. And that is why I think many Russians still misunderstand the relationship. They imagine that China sees Russia as a civilizational equal, a great culture, and a historic force. China may politely say some of that, but what it actually sees is simpler. A weakened neighbor with resources and few alternatives. That does not mean Beijing wants to swallow Russian territory. China does not need to invade Russia to get what it wants. Dependence is much cheaper than occupation. And if you can get the oil, the gas, the market, the diplomatic alignment, and the strategic breathing room without paying the price of conquest, why would you start a costly war? What the West fears. Western audiences usually ask the wrong question first. They ask, Are Russia and China becoming friends? That is not the real problem. The real problem is that even without any love, trust, or formal alliance, they can still make the world more dangerous together. That is what the West should fear. The first real fear is Europe. For a long time, many Europeans tried to keep two separate mental boxes. Russia was the security threat, China was the trade problem. That separation is getting harder to sustain. More and more European analysts now say openly that the two theaters are linked. If China helps Russia stay afloat in Ukraine, then China is part of Europe's security problem too. That changes the whole picture. It means European leaders can no longer pretend that business with Beijing is somehow detached from the war on their own continent. China may not be firing missiles at Kharkov, but if it keeps feeding the Russian machine with trade, electronics, industrial support, and diplomatic cover, then Europe is already dealing with a joint problem, even if the two partners still deny it. The second fear is Taiwan. Some people imagine that Beijing looks at Ukraine as a direct rehearsal and that Moscow will automatically assist in some synchronized attack on the democratic world. It is not that simple. But the connection is still real. China studies this war carefully. It studies sanctions, Western coercion, drone warfare, and the speed of industrial mobilization. It also studies something else. How useful it is when the West is forced to spend money, attention, and weapons in Europe instead of Asia. The third fear is strategic confusion. Authoritarian partnerships like this one are often messy. China helps Russia, but often in ways that stay deniable. Russia backs China rhetorically, but without surrendering formal independence. So Western policymakers keep wasting time arguing about categories. Is this an alliance? Is this co-belligerence? Is this just trade? Meanwhile, the practical effect keeps growing. And here is the fourth fear, maybe the most important one. A lot of people in the West still assume that tension between Russia and China will eventually save them. They say, relax, they have too much historical mistrust. Relax, they both want to dominate too much to cooperate effectively. This is lazy thinking. China and Russia do not need perfect trust to harm Western interests. They only need overlapping incentives. And right now, those incentives are strong enough. China wants the United States stretched thin and Europe nervous. Russia wants proof that it is not isolated and still matters globally. Europe wants to avoid war and keep trade alive. America wants to deter China without losing Europe. Put all of that together, and you get a very unstable system where Moscow and Beijing are already creating serious trouble. So, what should the West actually fear? Not a Red Empire reborn. It should fear the current patient, asymmetrical partnership in which China keeps Russia alive just enough to remain useful, while Russia keeps the democratic world distracted, divided, and more expensive to defend. Before we move on, I'd like to show you a short trailer for my historical novel set in China during the Roaring '20s, The White Ghosts Empire. I want to tell you a story about a city once called the splendor of the East and the horror of Asia. Shanghai, the 1920s, jazz drifting through open windows, opium smoke curling beneath chandeliers, white colonists in white suits, certain they were untouchable. Then the Russians arrived, not as conquerors, as refugees. Thousands fleeing the Bolsheviks, stepping onto the docks with nothing. To survive, they scrubbed floors, hauled crates, worked for a bowl of rice. And in doing so, they shattered the illusion of white supremacy, while the Chinese watched closely. And somewhere far away, Moscow was watching too, quietly dreaming of turning the ancient celestial empire into its greatest prize. The White Ghost's Empire, a historical novel about exile rising from the ashes and the clash of the mightiest powers on earth. Where this ends. So where does this logic lead? It leads to a smaller Russia. Not smaller on the map, at least not yet. Smaller in options, ambitions, economic freedom and sovereignty, even while it screams about sovereignty all day long. The Kremlin tells Russians that the turn to China proves strength. We are not isolated, we have alternatives, the East is rising, the West is decaying, history is on our side. It is a very flattering story. But the actual movement underneath the slogans runs in the opposite direction. A country becomes less sovereign when one outside power gains growing influence over its energy routes, industrial supplies and technology imports. You can still wave the flag while this is happening. You can still shout about multipolarity. But if more and more of your real economy depends on one stronger partner, then your room to act is shrinking. That is what is happening to Russia. And the tragedy is that China does not even need to push very hard. It can afford to be patient. It can watch Russia burn political capital, military capital, Soviet inheritance, and access to the West, while Beijing keeps building in the industries that matter most for the next generation of power. The Kremlin still thinks status can substitute for capacity. It thinks that if China treats Russia ceremonially as a great power, then Russia remains one in substance. But modern power is not maintained by ceremony. It is maintained by technology, industry, capital, institutional competence, and options. China has more of all of this. Russia has less of all of this than it did before the war. And war accelerates the gap. The likely outcome is not open Chinese domination in some crude colonial form. It is something subtler and more humiliating. Russia will keep speaking like an empire while behaving more and more like a commodity appendage with nuclear weapons. And this is why I think the final irony is so cruel. Putin went to war in part because he could not bear the idea of Russia becoming smaller in history. He wanted to force the world to treat Russia as a giant again. Instead, he's driving Russia into the one position its elites should fear most: dependence on a stronger civilization that does not need to invade it, because it can simply wait for the discounts to get better. Before we go, I want to ask you something specific. Have you ever seen a friendship between two people, companies, or countries, where one side kept praising the other as an equal, while quietly taking the better deal? What gave it away? The money? The timing? The language? The fact that one side had options and the other didn't? If this video helped you see the Russia-China relationship more clearly, please like the video and subscribe. Share it with one person who still thinks Moscow and Beijing are equal partners building a new Soviet bloc. And if you want to support this work directly, you can join my think tank or use PayPal or SuperThanks. You can also tap high points to help this episode travel further. And if you are listening on Spotify, follow the show so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for watching. See you next time.